Last year, both Belgium and the Netherlands, home to the key ports of Antwerp-Bruges and Rotterdam, reported a dramatic decline in the volume of cocaine seized. As the traditional gateways into Europe for legal as well as illegal cargo, this is surely cause for celebration, or at the very least, a pat on the back. The only problem is that seizures in Portugal, Italy, Greece, and other southern European countries actually increased. Which begs the question, how on earth do you stop smuggling? My name is Joshua Minchin. I'm a reporter here at Lloyd's List, and if you haven't listened to the first part of this series, it might be a good idea to pause here and listen to that first. Our four speakers did a great job of laying bare just how big of a problem the smuggling of both narcotics and wildlife through ports is, and made the somewhat damning admission that, in reality, halting this illegal flow is incredibly difficult. But that's what we're charging ourselves with in this second part of our dive into shipping's secret trade. How do we even begin to fight back against smuggling? Well, Antwerp-Bruges' harbour master, Niels van Laar, told me that the first step as a port is to look in the mirror. If you listen to the last episode, you'll know that Niels spoke to me from his office on the quayside at the port itself, so please do excuse a slight drop in audio quality.
Well, the first thing that we did different is acknowledging the problem. And we did that with our partners in Rotterdam, with our partners in Hamburg. And I call them really partners because they are competing ports, of course. But when we talk about safety and security, we have a great cooperation with them. And together with our home cities, city of Antwerp, city of Rotterdam, city of Hamburg, we've set up a number of things. We brought together police officers, we brought together customs officers, we have meetings where we discuss modus operandi, where we discuss evolutions that we see. And in that way, as a port, really what we do as the Port Authority is doing what we do for so many industries, and this time we do it for law enforcement, that is supporting them in their business. So we are not law enforcers ourselves. We will not do the crime fighting ourselves. But through sharing data, through our network, through bringing people together, we can do a lot. We did that for Antwerp. We did the same. I know Rotterdam is doing the same. We do the same in a coordinated way together with Hamburg. And that way, you actually remove a part of the barriers that there are. Because if I would tell a terminal, let me explain this. If I would tell a terminal, you need to make serious investments in the perimeter control, etc., install cameras on what you have. The first thing they will say is, yes, but how about my competitors in Rotterdam, in Flushing, etc.? By cooperating on an international level, we are able to exclude that argument, to put that argument away, and we can say, yes, but in Rotterdam, your competitor has to make exactly the same investments right now. And that sounds very stupid and very basic, but it's actually a big barrier. And by cooperating and by setting the same standards, we have removed that barrier, actually. What we do on a local level is a lot of cooperation. We can use innovative methods. Let's not focus too much on them. Yes, there are possibilities with AI. There are possibilities with drones, with smart cameras, etc. We have installed them. We use them. We give the data that come out of these to the police. But it's not much more than supporting the police in doing their work, in doing their investigative work. And we just share the data, no questions asked. We don't get involved in the actual investigations. We don't need to be. So those are mainly the things, but as I said in the beginning, it started from recognizing that we have a problem. I feel that there are still many, many ports in Europe, but also around the world, who say, well, smuggling, it's for police, it's for justice, it's not our problem, really. But as long as a port authority, you don't recognize it, there's no way you can do something about it. And I think those are maybe the biggest changes that we make, that's making use of the network and, first of all, recognize there is something wrong. And I feel the same also with shipping companies, where they say, hey, yes, We are part of the problem, but we are also part of the solution. And that way we can get a long way, because I don't have to tell you or your listeners, the logistic chain is a lot of parties combined. And if each and every single one of this chain recognizes something and recognizes their role and recognizes that they can be part of a solution, then you get a whole way in raising more and more and more barriers towards the criminal organizations.
It will probably come as no surprise to hear that cooperation is key to this, but how do you bring together so many different stakeholders with very different priorities? Here's Joe Kramick, Chief Executive of the World Shipping Council.
One of the most important things that the World Shipping Council's work has done in this space is to establish the importance of public-private partnerships and show how they can be a force multiplier to fight and combat this threat. We started back probably 3.5 years ago. We were meeting at the World Customs Organization in Brussels, and we had several of our member lines and international customs authorities, probably about 15 of them. And we were having a discussion, and they were telling us what they thought were, let's call, red flag indicators in liner shipping. And, many of those things that they thought were red flags were business as usual for us. And we could tell they didn't understand our industry. And similarly, we could tell that we had a lot to learn and gain from them on how we could be more vigilant and harden our containers from contamination. So it was at that meeting that we decided to stand up the first ever, to my knowledge, a joint industry customs Operation Tin Can. And that was really foundational, because for building the trust, for building the relationship, to law enforcement needed to become comfortable with us and say, okay, if I give them, sensitive information, I know that, it won't get into the wrong hands, and it will help them, point out for me more things that they're seeing. And similarly, we were able to give law enforcement information on containers that our systems were showing had anomalies or weren't moving the way you'd expect them to through the supply chain, and say, if you were going to look at any 20 containers on this ship coming into Rotterdam or Antwerp, these are the ones I would look at. And so that's a long explanation, but the point there is, can be summarized as the public-private partnership is key to this effort. And what we're really all trying to do is assist law enforcement with their targeting.
As I just mentioned, those stakeholders, while all pulling in the same direction, have very different aims. While carriers and ports want to ensure their vessels and terminals are not soft targets for smugglers, they also want high throughput statistics. And the more containers you check, the more disruption to what are often very highly tuned logistics flows you cause. Here's Bob van den Berg, who is Deputy Head of the Passenger and Cargo Control Programme at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime.
Now, let me first of all say, on an annual basis, there are around 860 million movements of TEUs of containers worldwide, which is an enormous figure. And looking at it, less than 2% of these containers are being inspected, which of course is a very low figure. And that's why it's so important to have like an accurate profiling, and that we are able, together with the PCCP units or the PCCP supported units, on how to identify, let's say, potential high-risk consigns or high-risk containers. Because once that a container, I would say, arrives at the port, if you have already identified these suspicious containers, these are the ones that need to be inspected, and it will not hamper, I would say, the flow of containers or the flow and movements of containers within a port. So it's not a question of the number of containers to be inspected. I would say it's rather looking at inspecting and scanning the right containers, which of course would be beneficial for all actors working in the port.
Now, I'm sure you can appreciate the reluctance of our guests to reveal any specifics on how high-risk containers are identified. After all, this podcast is free to listen to and available on SoundCloud, Spotify and Apple Podcasts, even if the world's top drug kingpins aren't subscribed to Lloyd's list, which I'm sure they are. Here's Bob and Joe to give you an idea of how a carrier, port, or law enforcement might identify a container worth taking a closer look at.
What we consider a container of high risk, I mean, it's based on risk analyzing. First of all, risk analyzing, where we train law enforcement officers on how to recognize risk indicators in commercial documents, manifests, bill of lading, invoices, and so on. That's one component, but also the routing, of course, it's something to keep an eye on. We have seen in the past, and we recently even have seen that sometimes criminal organizations are trying to hide, I would say, the origin of certain containers. This is something else to take in account. We've seen also several trends of modus operandi of hiding illicit goods. First of all, the modus operandi when it comes to some of the narcotics, we've seen, for example, that cocaine is being impregnated now in some legal goods such as timber, textile, and even in food, which is even more worrying. So, I mean, they are quite adventurous, the criminal organizations, and this is where we are trying with the team, with the program, to deliver the right training in order to ensure that we come to a very accurate profiling of these potential high-risk consignments in terms of modus operandi, in terms of routing.
There were things out there, I can speak of generally that, say that in a refrigerated container, our members invested, in technology to make sure that if there was a problem with the stability of the temperature in the container, that they would get an alert because they need to send a tech to take a look at whether the HVAC system is operating correctly in order to protect fungible cargoes like fruits and vegetables. And so those types of alerts, say that the temperature drops 3 degrees in a container at a transshipment point in Panama, that could be an indicator to where we could pass along to customs authorities and say, you might want to look at this container because the temperature dropped 3 degrees and the temperature should have been stable. And that could be an indicator that it was breached and somebody opened the door. So that's an example. I mean, I'm hesitant to give you specific operational examples, but I think, generally, Operation Tin Can, it was a great success. So the World Customs Organization set up an operations center in Brussels, led by the Australian Border Force, and our participating member lines directly sent information that they thought were anomalies or red flags into that operation center. We don't know what they did with that information, but presumably they applied, law enforcement techniques and methods and perhaps intelligence methods. And in the 4 weeks' time that we ran that operation, over 100 million tons of cocaine was seized. And there were, I think, over 43 arrests. So that shows you the power of, of that particular type of collaboration when you can come together.
The rush of discovering a huge volume of cocaine or illegal wildlife inside a container after a painstakingly coordinated investigation must simply be huge. But United for Wildlife Programme Director Robert Campbell says that's actually where the hard work should start.
The seizure should be the beginning of an investigation, not the end. And so, all the work that goes into something where you're able to open, the goods and find the illegal commodity, whether it's drugs or wildlife or anything, that should be the beginning in investigation. We do a lot of work, or there's a lot of work that can be done, particularly by shipping companies, but also airlines being another sort of route to look into those, who paid for it, how many times is that sort of signee, use this facility. Because typically criminals will move products along a certain route until they get caught, and then they'll flick. But they'll move a lot on a certain route, and then if they get caught, they flick the route, they change something. So typically when you caught something, you should be able to find other instances by the same organization that have happened before. And it's just a lot of information that can be exploited from these. There's so much that you can piece together. The bill of lading, of course, it's probably going to be fraudulently, filled out. It's been misdeclared, or or something like that. But there's still evidence on there that can be picked up and analysed, and learnings can be taken from that, so that you can pass them on and hopefully deter future activities. And I mean, I sort of jump a bit, but that's what United for Wildlife tries to do. Is it tries to raise the awareness of wildlife trafficking amongst corporate sector, the shipping companies, and it aims to provide lessons learned or best practices, so that other, where there has been a failing or a learning, other shipping companies or organizations can be better at responding or disrupting. The crucial thing here is you're not trying to make one organization very good at this. You're trying to make the industry very good at it. And so it's not a whack-a-mole thing where you stop one, so they go to the other. Really restrict their ability to move. And that's what we've tried to do with our sort of transport task force.
Whack-a-mole really is a great turn of phrase from Rob there. We mentioned the concerning nature of the waterbed or water balloon effect when it comes to the battle against smuggling. We opened this episode with the heartening news that cocaine seizures had decreased in Belgium and the Netherlands last year, and then snatched that hope away by explaining that seizures elsewhere had actually increased. The best way to fight any disease is to target the source rather than the symptoms. So here's Bob to explain how UNODC works with authorities in source countries to prevent illicit cargo being loaded onto commercial ships in the first place.
One of the main objectives of our program is that we deliver training to these multi-agency units, meaning when we go into such a country, first of all, we always ensure that we've got like a letter of agreement or a written agreement with the national authorities to work together in the country. And this program, it's also based on funding, which means without any donors for us, it would be impossible to implement this program. When we talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, our main donors are the US, Canada, the European Union, and also some bilateral countries from the European Union who are supporting us in this region. Depending on the region where we work, I mean, if we work, for example, in Southeast Asia, South Asia, then of course we talk about other partners such as in Australia, such as Japan, which are also very important partners to us. But again, once that we do have an agreement with the country and the funding is in place, that's where the real work starts for us, meaning that we will travel with two of our experts, two of our trainers towards the countries, towards the maritime port, where we will deliver a theoretical training, meaning what type of containers exist, what kind of documentation exists, also on how to recognize risk indicators, how will we be using open sources. So all this kinds of topics are being part of the theoretical training. Now, following the theoretical training, we go into what we call the practical training, where we will be training the law enforcement officers on how to physically inspect containers. This means how can they recognize if a seal has been manipulated? How can I see if there is a hidden space in the structure of the container? Can I see when I open a container the way it has been stuffed that there is already something suspicious? And this, of course, we will link it also to the procedures that are in place in a port. And this is what we call the practical training. This program, the PCCP, it's, as we always say, it's not a quick fix, meaning that we will deliver training and we will buy some equipment so these interagencies units can do their work. But we will be visiting these units each 2-3 months again. And this is what we call a kind of a mentoring, a monitoring of the unit, where we are having a look, are they applying, I would say, the principles that we have trained them for? And it's also looking together with them what might be a training that is of added value. For example, if you are being part of a unit as a law enforcement officer in Central America, well, then it might be interesting to also receive some training related to chemical precursors. If we are working, for example, in the Caribbean, then it might be interesting to have an advanced training more related to arms and ammunition. So in this context, we are visiting the units each 2-3 months. We train them again. We identify specialized and advanced training that we can deliver to them. And then as a final stage, and I think that's also a very important stage because this is how we link the different regions worldwide, We also are trying to organize what we call study visits, where we will bring officers from these interagency units, let's say, for example, from Latin America, towards ports such as Antwerp, such as Rotterdam, such as Hamburg, and where we give them the opportunity to work 1 week together with their counterparts in a destination country. Now, this is very important. First of all, it's very important because very often we do see that people working in a source port or people working in a transshipment port are not always aware, I would say, of the procedures that are in place in a destination port. And being over there and working with their counterparts helps them to understand how it's functioning at the destination. But secondly, it's also establishing a network, because in the end, if I have been working for 1 week together with my colleagues in a destination, if afterwards I would receive a request from them or I would receive an email from them with a request, then at least I would know the face behind the email, which of course will create much more trust. Probably I will reply to him in a much more open way. And in this context, we are trying to establish like very trustful networks between the different regions.
Now, listening to last week's episode, you may have gotten the impression that shipping and law enforcement is fighting a losing battle, and as Rob said, doomed to play whack-a-mole across the world's ports for eternity. But Bob says progress has been made thanks to the improved relations between industry and authority.
I think if I would look forward in 2-3 years and I would need to speak or to resume what we have already done, I can tell you, or I can even compare, I would say, a few years ago, we saw a completely different approach or a more isolated approach, I would say, from private sector, from public sector. We have now seen that they have come to each other. They are talking to each other. Even national authorities are talking a lot with public sector or with shipping companies. And I really see a very goodwill and efforts from private companies. So I'm quite sure in terms of exchange of information, working together, if we can make more progress in this area in 2-3 years, then I think more hits will come to criminal organization.
Last week's episode ended on a somewhat downbeat tone, so hopefully this week's episode has restored a bit of faith for you. Organisations like the WSC, United for Wildlife and UNODC, together with big ports like Antwerp-Bruges, are on the front line in the war against smuggling. And to hear of such improved cooperation between all stakeholders in this battle should fill us all with a bit more confidence that our vessels and ports are not simply tools to be used by unscrupulous criminals who have little regard for the crew or port workers in the way, and they're the ones that often face dire consequences when illicit cargo is uncovered. That's it for this week. Thank you so much again to Bob, to Joe, Rob and Niels for their honesty and insights once again, and thank you for listening. We'll be back next week in our usual Monday slot to bring you more of the stories shaping shipping. But if you can't wait until then, don't forget that every episode of the Lloyd's List podcast is available on SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as the Lloyd's List app. Thank you so much for listening. We'll speak to you again soon. Goodbye.